Good evening and welcome to our second session of our CPD sessions in Theology, Philosophy and Religion. We're delighted to welcome Michael Wilcockson, our Chief Setter at ISEB and Chair of our Editorial Endorsement Committee, who is also our Team Leader for TPR. The aim of these sessions is to support you in delivering the new specifications for CE, with a session focusing on evolving the specification, exploring the philosophy of feminism and gender within the context of common entrance. This webinar comes as a sequel to our previous Twilight TPR session in March, in which we discussed integrating equity, diversity, and inclusion into teaching techniques. I do hope you enjoyed this session with Michael, and let me remind you to find us on social media at ISEB Awards on all channels. Once this session is finished, there will be time for questions. Please use the chat function as in YouTube. If you aren't logged into Google or YouTube, then you should log in to get access to the chat function and submit your questions live. Sophie will make note of your questions and ensure they are answered in our Q&A later. So without much further ado, let me hand you over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and good evening, everybody. It's very good to be with you, and I'm no doubt I've met some of you on other sessions elsewhere. So I'm going to ask the presentation now, and we'll begin my chat this evening. So, with the first slide. Thank you. These are the ICB core aims, and what I want to do this evening is just to pick up with some of these into what you might think of as being an extension topic, or one you may want to teach and perhaps get your pupils to use if they're going to sit the exam itself. If I start right at the very top, I think what makes any subject worthwhile is its sense of adventure and love of learning. And it's very easy as a teacher to become stale, especially with doing examination preparation. So it's always a very good idea to have a topic perhaps up your sleeves which is not directly on the specification, which is one which enhances what you're doing. The topic I'm going to choose this evening will certainly explore, if you look at the left-hand side, knowledge and understanding, and particularly critical thinking. I'm going to be focusing on philosophy as such, but all three elements of theology, philosophy, and religion must include critical thinking, and that means being able to have some autonomy to think for yourself, to think outside the box, to make connections between topics. And if you can do that, then what it gives you intellectually, and indeed the topic this evening, which is quite complex, is emotional as well as academic confidence and resilience. So the topic I'll be looking at at the moment is one, of course, of much discussed, and in the last few years, one that has affected not only my sector of teaching secondary, but I imagine also further down at much younger age, which is an openness and curiosity and discovery about one's own self and one's own identity. Next slide, Sophie, thank you. So we're going to be thinking about the causes of discrimination. You can do this in a number of different ways. If I just pull out some topics here from the existing spec, there are opportunities here to discuss identity, specifically gender, perhaps by looking at the story of David and Bathsheba. In philosophy, there is a section here specifically marked on Bentham on liberty, and on freedoms and autonomies, and it also mentions here women's suffrage and rights. Topic 2 has a whole section here which you can easily pick up on prejudice and discrimination and freedom. And notice here the causes of prejudice and discrimination and various ethical issues surrounding the treatment of the marginalised. And as from this summer, and you may want to make a note of this, the spec will be revised with an EG after the word marginalised to say women, LGBTQ, the poor, and race. Now, as an EG, it doesn't mean that questions will be set specifically on that. What it is, it's a cue to you, and the questions will acknowledge this, to go wider, to give you particular examples of what the marginalised mean. And I realise marginalised can mean all sorts of different things, but there is your e.g. women, LGBTQ, the poor and race. If you're teaching the religion section, you might want to look at the particular example of Siddhartha in Buddhism. She's the one who brings the Buddha a bowl of rice to eat after he's been fasting. And in many Buddhist traditions, she's a highly significant figure. You might like to look at the female deities and how they're portrayed and what that says about women's identity within Hinduism. There's a whole controversy over the sacred thread ceremony as to whether this includes both women as well as men, or young boys and girls. Increasingly in Islam, there's a breakdown in the division of seating arrangement between men and women in mosques, and indeed whether you can have women imams. The debate's been going on for some time in Reform and Orthodox Judaism between the different rules about what's appropriate, what is fitting, and kashrut, and whether you can have women rabbis, as the same kind of discussion going on in Catholicism. And you have an interesting idea in Sikhism on sewa and service, and whether that applies to all human beings equally. So there you are. There's a number of places you can do this, but I'm going to be focusing particularly on philosophy this evening and the place of feminism. Next slide, please. Now, the way I'm going to do this evening is think how you might want to teach this. So imagine at the moment you are a pupil in your own class, how you might pick up and develop some of these questions. Now, I've not necessarily aimed them at pupils themselves, but to you, and you'll want to adapt these for yourself. Right back in the 1970s, which kind of marks the beginning of second wave feminism, some of you may well have come across her, Juliet Mitchell. Her background, as you look at these questions, are distinctly from a Marxist tradition. And the 4 questions, in fact, I tried this out in a group of teachers not so long ago, is to ask, have these questions that were posed in the 70s, have they been really answered here in the 2020s? So let's have a look at them very quickly. The phrase means of production is a particularly Marxist one, but it might be picking up here with what we might call the glass ceiling effect. Do women have full access to the workplace? Do they have full acknowledgement? There's been plenty of debate about pay differentials. So you might ask your class, here are questions being asked in the 70s, what do you think? Are men and women being paid exactly the same at the moment? A really interesting one here is sometimes called the myth of motherhood. We're going to pick up this in a moment when we look at Simone de Beauvoir. But it touches on the idea of gender identity. What's it mean to be a mother? Is motherhood something completely irrelevant to one's sense of identity as a woman? And indeed, where's the place of reproduction and ideas of having children both within both sexes, both genders? What about this idea here of the myth of woman as source of sex and love? Quite often this is seen as a submissive role, one which is a source of alienation. And this might lead us on to the last of the 4 areas which she felt were sources of exploitation and alienation, which is the idea of the carer. There's a whole area under dispute amongst feminist writers about whether women have this as a particular gift of their own identity. Certainly for Mitchell, she regarded that as a source of alienation and patriarchy. So you might just like to look at these words for a moment. Quite often I find a good way into discussing a topic is to take some key words. If we're going to build up our vocabulary here to express ourselves more clearly, it's worth finding out what these words mean. And like all words, giving them definitions is not so easy. So think to yourself how you would define some, or indeed all, of the following. as we're not here to discuss it, let me just run through some of these at least. So patriarchy is a particularly interesting one, as it applies not just to individuals, but really to institutions. And often it's linked with a mindset or language, which therefore has a structural bias towards men, and therefore prioritize those consciously or otherwise to male superiority. Androcentric is the idea that values are male-centered, very similar to patriarchy, but perhaps applying more to individuals. Alienation is the idea of being an outsider, of being dehumanized, of being objectified. False consciousness is a particularly interesting one, which we'll pick up with Simone de Beauvoir. And that is seeing the world which you think is true, but which is not actually the case. I won't say more about that because I think that's an important point which Simone de Beauvoir in the talk in a moment will want to highlight for you. Autonomy here is the idea of self-rule, equality of opportunity, sort of speaks for itself. A difficult one is whether one should have a bias towards those who have not had that equality of opportunity to make it a fairer playing field. Sexism, of course, could apply to either sex in terms of favouring one over the other, but has traditionally been the view that men have regarded women as an inferior sex in some ways. And an area which is extremely difficult to discuss now and to define is gender. Generally speaking, we would see sex as being a biological definition and gender as being culturally determined in terms of one's sense of self and identity. The glass ceiling I've mentioned, which is that women can't reach the top because of the patriarchal structures of society, and a stereotype would be a generalized view. So if you've discussed all these, then what do they think are particular causes of alienation and discrimination? And I would suggest that they all are, except for perhaps the ideas of gender and sex. Well, having got this vocabulary sorted out and understood that it's not defined necessarily as dictionary, and one of the important things in philosophy essays and any discussion is that simply referring to a dictionary is not enough. It has to be one where you work out your own definitions. Okay, look at the following slides. Which of these do you think refers to the words which we've looked at? I'll give you a moment to have a think about that. And of course, it's the discussion which is important. The top left might refer to patriarchy, which gives sees things unfavorably biased towards men and structures. The picture in the middle of the top, perhaps towards stereotyping of a certain view of femininity and gender. The right, obviously, is to the glass ceiling. The bottom left has the sense of being alienated, of being the other. Perhaps you come across this phrase of the other, and othering is to objectify and therefore to not make somebody part of your particular group, the out group. And the bottom right could perhaps be the idea of false consciousness, seeing things in a particular kind of way into the glasses. All right, so let's now focus on Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir, as we'll find out in a moment, was a prolific writer. She was a teacher herself for most of her life. She was the lover of Jean-Paul Sartre. They shared a love of philosophy. They were the rivals and competitors and lovers all at the same time. And it's her works which we're going to be focusing on in a moment. So what I've written is a dialogue, which in fact we're going to be acting out for you in a moment for you to think about. So here's some questions you might, if you're doing this, you can pose to your classes to think about. So here are the questions, simply in sort of common entrance style. You know, what do you know? So when you're listening to dialogue, listen out for who was Simon's best friend, what was her most famous book, where did she study, who was her lover and rival and friend, I've told you already, and name the American feminist who interviewed her in the United States, an important person I'll pick up in a moment. What's the name of the philosophy which influenced her? How is gender different from sex? What does she mean by one is not born but rather becomes a woman, perhaps one of her most famous phrases? What is meant by false consciousness in Simone de Beauvoir's particular understanding of it? And finally, some questions for discussion. Is it wrong for women to want to go into the caring professions? Should we not use the terms feminine and masculine? What issues do you think feminists should be dealing with today? So I will play the role of Sophia. Simone will be played by Sophie. I've chosen Sophia simply because in Greek, as you know, as in philosophy, it means one who loves wisdom. So here goes. Think about those questions, and we will now give you a dramatized version of Sophie interviewing Simone.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Simone, for allowing me to meet with you today and discuss your ideas. I've read your autobiography, Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, which you published in 1958. Clearly, two men were very important in your early life, your mother and your close friend Zaza. How have they shaped your ideas of women and feminism?
Well, before I answer your question directly, Sophia, I probably need to fill in with some background. I was born into an upper-middle-class French family in 1908. My intellectual father was an atheist and inspired in me a love of learning. My mother was a devout Roman Catholic, and for many years, until I was 14 years old, I contemplated becoming a nun.
So what happened when you were 14?
I think I suddenly realized that religion, or at least Roman Catholicism, was far too controlling, especially of women. I looked at my mother and how submissive she was to my father. She was bringing me up to be a dutiful daughter, and that meant leaving school, getting married, having children, and being a good wife and mother. I realized even then that I wanted more than this.
So what happened?
Well, you know how people have a sudden conversion to Christianity? I had a sudden conversion into atheism at the age of 14. Now that I was free from religion, it made me question everything, and I wanted to follow in the intellectual footsteps of my father. So after studying at various colleges, I went in 1927 to the Sorbonne University in Paris to study philosophy.
Was it unusual for women to go to university?
Yes, it was. At Oxford and Cambridge, for instance, women had recently been allowed to study, but at Cambridge they couldn't get a degree until the late 1940s. It was different at the Sorbonne, but people didn't think women could really be academics. I wanted to prove them wrong, and I particularly wanted to show how much better I was at philosophy than the brilliant young male student called Jean-Paul Sartre.
And did you?
Not quite, but I did come second to him in the final philosophy exams.
Did you become friends?
We did, and then we became lovers and thought about getting married.
But you didn't get married, did you? Why not?
To begin with, it was because we hadn't got enough money, and then it occurred to both of us that marriage would mean neither of us would be free, and for me especially it would mean fulfilling the stereotype of being a dutiful wife and mother. I wanted so much more than this. I wanted to show women that to be fully human, we women must fundamentally shift the way that we think about ourselves.
You mentioned Zaza earlier. Did she influence your philosophy?
She did. She was my best friend, and I admired her for her independence and love of life, but died when she was just short of her 22nd birthday. I was heartbroken. Her death made me realize how brief our lives are if we are to achieve anything. In my philosophy, I call this experience finitude.
You said that at university you fell in love with your academic rival, Jean-Paul Sartre. How has he influenced you?
Jean-Paul was working on a philosophical idea which he called existentialism. Many philosophies are existential, but Jean-Paul wanted to make people much more aware of its ideas.
And what are its basic ideas?
The most important idea is that there is no God. And as there is no God, life is meaningless. So it is we who have to invent meaning and give purpose to our lives. This is not easy and requires a lot of effort, or otherwise we just let ourselves become what our parents or our teachers or society decide we should be. He called this false consciousness, or bad faith.
So what do you do after university?
I became a secondary school teacher, but at the same time wrote novels and plays and books on philosophy, politics, and ethics. Jean-Paul and I lived together until his death 51 years later, but we agreed that as we weren't married, we could each have other lovers. That was really important if we were to live genuine, existentially free lives.
Perhaps we could now focus on your most influential book on feminism, The Second Sex, which was published in France in 1949. It is most famous for the phrase you used to describe how women have suffered from sexism and patriarchy. One is not born, but rather one becomes a woman. Could you explain what you mean by this?
It means that there is no such thing as gender. What happens is that every girl or boy baby is born free, but their parents and society teach them to become feminine or masculine. Being masculine is better because at least men can choose to work and become leaders, but women are expected to be the feminine second or weaker sex by being carers such as mothers, wives, nurses, and teachers.
So if this is society's fault, then changing the laws and making life fair for women and giving them equal opportunities should solve the problems of unfairness, shouldn't it?
You might think so, but what I have found is that many women actually want to buy into the feminine stereotype. They think being feminine and wearing feminine clothes, wearing makeup, being carers and nurses, becoming mothers and so on is living a fulfilling, independent life. How can that be so? These are all examples of false consciousness, which, as I said a moment ago, just make women servants to men. It is what a patriarchal society, a society controlled by men, wants women to be. It is not deep down what women want.
I know you haven't always liked using the term feminist, but you've been involved in the women's movement, haven't you?
Yes, I have been heavily involved in the women's movement, both in France and abroad. I caused quite a stir when I was interviewed by the influential American feminist Betty Friedan in 1975.
Why was that?
If I remember rightly, I said, no woman should be authorized to stay at home and raise her children. Society should be different. Women should not have that choice, precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make that one.
I know that since his death, you have written about Jean-Paul Sartre and published his letters. Do you think what you have written will still be read in 50 years' time?
That's an interesting question. In some ways, I hope that in 50 years' time there will be no need for women and men to read my books, because society will have changed. But on the other hand, existentialism shows us that humans like to invent false ideas. So maybe what I've written will continue to make people rethink what they assume is true.
Well, I hope so. So Simone died in 1986 in Paris at the age of 78. And if you go to France, you can see that she's buried next door to Jean-Paul Sartre in Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris. And there's some pictures of her young, middle-aged, and old age. They were a couple much celebrated and continue to be celebrated in France today. And her work's still much read. You might feel The Second Sex is quite a long book, is a little bit dated, but I think some of the questions that it raises are still ones which find resonance with us even now. So let's go back to those questions which I posed to you a little bit earlier. I don't know whether you've managed to work all these out. A little bit of commentary as I answer them myself. So her best friend was called Zaza. Very recently, about a year ago, it was found she had written a novel, which I recommend to you, called The Inseparables. And it's really autobiography about her relationship with Zaza. Zaza died tragically young, as it says in the dialogue. But if you wanted to do some literary work, and here's some cross subject reference, it's called The Inseparables. It's published by Vintage Press. It's about 100 pages long, so it really is a very short novel, and you can certainly find extracts from it. I suppose you would now say, and indeed it's true when she's older, she had a lesbian relationship with Zaza. So Simone de Beauvoir herself, we would now say, is bisexual. Her most famous book, of course, is The Second Sex, and you could probably now work out why she's used the phrase second sex. What makes it highly significant is that she's working through the relationship of patriarchy, and then to that second and very famous quotation in the What Do You Understand? One is not born, rather one becomes a woman. And what she shows is that all the different aspects of society have been, in a sense, geared towards women thinking of themselves and then believing that they should be subservient to men. Even, she thinks, powerful and strong women have fallen foul to this false consciousness. And you might want to explore that with your youngsters, your pupils themselves. How much do we think that we're free, but actually we're simply playing into the expectations of others? That's a more general existential question. So she studied at Sorbonne, and her lover and rival was Sartre. And some people suggest that, in fact, both Sartre and de Beauvoir's philosophy is best met through their plays and their novels, and indeed both were prolific in that area. The feminist who interviewed her is very interesting. This is Betty Friedan. Her famous book, which came out, is called The Feminine Mystique, and there's a lot in common between what she's written and what de Beauvoir has written. Betty Friedan, if you've come across her, did some research on mothers who had been graduates. It's a largely middle-class investigation. And what she found was that women who were playing the role of mother and dutiful housewife and so on were bored in what existentialism is called ennui, that sort of deep-seated sense of not just boredom, but of futility of one's own existence. And why? It's because they're playing to a mystique, an idea that women have a particular characteristic, which is the feminine, which only women can manage. And Friedan, a bit like Simone de Beauvoir, regarded this as a major source of alienation, of placing oneself in a role, a stereotypical role, which places you outside the main flow of society. The philosophy which is called existentialism. And at the heart of existentialism, I can make it very simple really, is the idea of being free. So to use the phrase, existence precedes essence, is the free life. You're born, you exist, and then you come to embrace ideas which slowly make you less free. And what women have done is to become essentialists, that is, to place ideas of being women, of being feminine, before their existence. De Beauvoir's writings, therefore, are to reverse that false consciousness. What is meant by false consciousness, therefore, is this false way of thinking. And particularly for de Beauvoir, motherhood is a major source of alienation. To want to have children, to want to become a mother, to want to become a dutiful daughter, and so on and so forth, are not freeing of women, but in fact entrapping them. So those are some of the answers to the test yourself, but obviously many more things you could talk about. And in the area of testing yourself, or the evaluation, of course, there are lots of things you could talk about. But one interesting one is the first question I put here: is it wrong for women to want to go into the caring professions? And you might think what the caring professions might be. That includes, of course, we might say teaching. Is teaching a very one of equality between men and women? Is it something which suits women better for some reason? Has the idea of caring become a virtue which is particularly appropriate for women to develop? And I say that because I think there's certainly amongst some feminists the idea that actually caring and the whole idea of collaboration is much more of a feminine quality than it is masculine. But even that begs questions. So that brings me on to the idea of gender fluidity. Much discussed, but what's it really mean? Is there such a thing as feminine and masculine? Should we abandon those ideas altogether? And that, of course, has stirred up some interesting discussions. My last question of what feminists should be dealing with today. As you might be aware, Germaine Greer and J.K. Rowling have both got themselves into serious hot water by questioning whether the whole trans movement at the moment is appropriate. Can somebody who is biologically male, as we're trans to become a woman, should they have the same rights if somehow they are not equipped in that way to be generally female and feminine in that sense? So there you are. There's a lot of things to think about, and I hope the dialogue would be, you could use it in all sorts of different ways. You can get small groups to work on it. You could play it in front of the class. You can think about it in terms of various projects which it might engender. Well, there you are. In half an hour, we've given you some thoughts to think about, and maybe we've got some questions now which we can discuss. Thank you, Sophie.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I do have a couple of questions that were pre-submitted before the webinar, and I'm just going to pop those on the screen here so everyone watching will be able to read them. I'll read them out and I'll hand them over to you to answer. So the first one we have is as follows. Do you consider different branches of feminism and arguments within feminist thought, such as interfeminist oppression, and how the movement can look different to different communities in the specification?
Just reading the question, it's quite a long question, isn't it?
I think it means just how can feminism look different to different people, and should we?
Well, I think that's true. And, you know, when we talk about feminism, really it should have an S at the end. There are feminisms of different kinds. I started with Sally Mitchell, and I mentioned she's a Marxist feminist. De Beauvoir herself is an existentialist feminist, and we can go on. Not all feminism means the same thing. The kind of feminism that one might pick up, say, from people like Mill and his subsequently later his wife Harriet Watson, is much more what we call a liberal or libertarian type feminism, which is simply looking at equality of rights. But then, as you can see, what de Beauvoir is suggesting is that rights aren't enough if you're suffering from, if there's a false consciousness. Even if you're given those rights, you might still entrap yourself in a false view of self and society. And that starts to make feminism extremely complicated. What happens when feminism is, let's say, adopted by a particular religious tradition? Well, we can see that division as it's occurred in, let's say, Orthodox and Reform Judaism. And indeed in Christianity itself. In most Western Christian traditions, there are male and female leaders, but that's not true, let's say, within Catholicism, which at the moment doesn't permit women to become priests. And indeed, in many conservative Christian traditions, women aren't allowed to teach, although they can have certain roles of leadership in different forms within their communities. So all I can say to you is it's extremely complex, and it's just worth bearing in mind that just to use feminism is not sufficient.
That's a very, very good answer. I like the idea of feminisms instead of feminism. Right. The next question is as follows. Have you found that teaching pupils about feminism and gender studies in the context of TPR affects their approach to the subject?
It's a very good question. I have to say that I taught this largely at a more senior level, from GCSE and particularly at A level, and there it certainly has. I think in engaging with it intellectually, and then it inevitably moves one on to have to think about it emotionally and personally as well. It has affected the approach to the subject, because then, of course, you become aware of, especially when you're looking at ancient origins of religion, where society is very different, you begin to wonder whether, in fact, that can be a source of authority. That's particularly true for biblical studies.
Right, I've just had a couple of questions through from the chat. I can't put those up on the screen, but I'll read them out to you. Do you recommend we discuss false consciousness? Could this lead to a patronizing view of people with different views or people who do not fight for rights? That's a very good question from Karen Jones.
It's an extremely good question. Well, to say to somebody you think they're suffering from false consciousness assumes, of course, doesn't it, that you are not suffering from false consciousness. So it could indeed sound patronizing. But I think the interesting question, the way that de Beauvoir puts it, at least, is just to think, why do you hold the values that you do? Where do you derive them from? How do you know that they're true? Now, you might go through all that process and still hold to them. But I agree, it could lead to the idea that other people's views are you regard as being misled. And that's always a fundamental problem. Let's say take something like Marxism. You know, Marxist sort of teaching is that the proletariat are chained not just economically, but also consciously as well. And you have to help them break free of their chains. And who does that? Well, you, the enlightened one. And I agree, that does sound rather patronizing. But good question. I think that'd make a very good class discussion.
That's an excellent question. Thank you so much for submitting your questions. The next question from the chat is from Christina Hearn. I'm sorry to be ignorant, I doubt you are, but are we still going to teach God's relationship with the world in this specification?
Yeah, that's still there. That's part of the theology strand, and it's the first part of that section. I don't know, Christian, you want to come back and elaborate on why you're worried about where that's going to happen?
If we don't manage to in the webinar, please do write into ISEB and I'll forward your question on to Michael after the webinar. But if you do have time, please put it in the chat and we can discuss it. All right, back to the pre-submitted questions. Please do keep the questions coming if you have any. Yep, but the next one is, how do you integrate empathetic discussions of marginalized sexualities and identities into the classroom?
Well, of course, that's a very good question, isn't it? And I think this has to be age-related to a certain extent. All these areas are sensitive at whatever age you do it, and you need to know your class well to be able to do that properly. I think the first thing is to be open-minded and to allow the fact that none of these questions have definitive answers. And in not allowing there to be definitive answers, we can carry on, therefore, to explore. I think one of the things you need to try and get pupils to do, and I know this is very difficult, is not to pose questions as if it's their own personal beliefs, but ideas which we're exploring. That distinction is very hard, I know. And adults find it just as difficult to explore an idea as if somehow it's expressing what they believe themselves. So all I can ask you is to teach the philosophical skills of critical thinking, to be critically aware of ideas and to explore them sensitively in terms of saying it's the idea we're exploring, not you as the person.
That's a very good answer. We have one last pre-submitted question, so last chance for anyone to submit their questions to the live stream. The next one, and the final one, is, how would you challenge Simone de Beauvoir's assertions about womanhood, should you feel inclined to? Should feminism not just be about choice? Or, following existential tradition, is there no real choice in a world so influenced by external influences?
Well, this is in fact the weakness of all existentialism. I mean, Sartre spent the whole of one novel trying to, I don't know, in his trilogy, the Road to Freedom, the first one's called The Age of Reason. And in it, if you don't know the story, the protagonist, that the man, his girlfriend, has become pregnant. And he spends most of the novel trying to secure her to have an abortion in the days when abortion was illegal, thinking that that would make her free because they then wouldn't have to have put up with having an unwanted child. What he failed to do, and Sartre explores this with magnificently, is he forgets to ask her. He just assumes that she doesn't want to have the baby. And it's a wonderful idea of, in his obsession with making her free, he's actually made himself less free. He's not an autonomous being, he's obsessed by the idea. And in her submissiveness to him, she actually, ironically and perversely, actually has more freedom because she's not become so much wound up with the idea of being free. Well, there you are, there are all the paradoxes. All I can say to you is that Simone de Beauvoir suffers a little bit from this. If you read the second section, she's incredibly critical of motherhood and of womanhood, and because they are essentialist ideas, they're ideas. And she says you've got to free yourself from that by not being those things. But then in not being those things, she says it rather dogmatically, have you not made yourself less free?
Happy untangling. All those who
Happy untangling, exactly.
Oh no, it's a lot of fun to untangle us, I imagine so, with the classroom. Right, if we don't have any more questions from the chat, and thank you to both of you who did submit questions to the chat, that is our time for today. So if anyone has any further questions or comments that you'd like to discuss with either myself or with our CEO Julia or with Michael, please do write into ISEB's email, and we will reply there, and we can continue this discussion. Thank you so much for attending. I wish you all a very happy evening.